Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through like a blade, sharp, unapologetic, and laced with fire. "You've hidden behind tradition long enough," she declared, her tone rising above the hum of shifting papers and shuffling seats. "The people deserve truth, not dusty lectures about values that never served us in the first place." Gasps echoed in the gallery. A few heads turned. Phones tilted up, already recording. The weight of her words hung heavy, daring anyone to challenge her. Crockett's eyes scanned the room, defiant, daring. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a hiss that carried farther than a shout. "And if that truth makes the powerful uncomfortable, then maybe they should be uncomfortable." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, electric, like the space before a thunderclap. Whispers began in the back rows, a ripple of nervous laughter from some, tight-lipped frowns from others. Crockett leaned back, lips pressed into a triumphant smile. For her, this was victory. The sting of her words had landed, and the room felt cornered. But then the camera shifted. Across the aisle, seated with a posture carved from stone, was Judge Ruth Bader. Her gaze did not waver, not once. Where Crockett burned with heat, Ruth radiated stillness, a calm that unnerved even in silence. Her fingers folded neatly, resting on the table. The contrast was undeniable, fire on one side, quiet endurance on the other. Every pair of eyes began to drift, one by one, toward Ruth. The murmurs softened into a hush, as if the room itself realized something was about to happen. She hadn't spoken yet, not a word, but her presence alone shifted the energy. Crockett's smirk faltered ever so slightly, betraying the first flicker of doubt. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Social media users, watching live feeds, hammered out breathless updates. She said, "What?" Wait for Ruth's reply. Clips were already being clipped, reactions already written in real time. But inside the chamber there was only that silence, thick, pressing, expectant. And then Ruth breathed in, slow and deliberate. The sound wasn't loud, yet it seemed to echo, commanding the moment without a syllable spoken. But no one expected the quiet pause that followed, or how Judge Ruth would reply. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to step back and see the battleground for what it truly was. Not just a chamber filled with lawmakers, but a stage where America's future was being contested. Every debate inside those walls carried echoes far beyond the marble columns. It wasn't merely about policies or procedural squabbles. It was about identity, about the soul of a nation still grappling with who gets to define its values. Jasmine Crockett had risen through this environment with a speed that made even her allies catch their breath. Young, sharp, and utterly unafraid to wield her words like weapons, she had mastered the art of confrontation. For her supporters, she was a necessary disruption to stale tradition. She carried herself with the energy of a generation unwilling to accept silence or compromise, and that raw electricity followed her everywhere she spoke. To her critics, however, Crockett represented something else. Arrogance, recklessness, a voice more concerned with volume than vision. On this day, she knew all eyes were on her. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters clutched pens, ready to declare the victors and the humiliated. Crockett leaned into that spotlight, hurling not just arguments but challenges to an entire system she saw as rotten. Her words painted Ruth Bader not as a dignified jurist, but as a relic standing in the way of progress. And yet, beneath the fury, there was calculation. Crockett understood the game of modern politics. In an age where a 10-second clip could outlive a 10-hour hearing, she knew how to feed the internet what it craved. Drama, spectacle, confrontation. Her sharp cadence, her carefully timed pauses, the way she arched an eyebrow after each barb, it was theater as much as it was policy. She wasn't speaking only to the chamber. She was speaking to millions beyond it, each of whom would either crown her as a fearless truth-teller or condemn her as reckless. That duality is what made this exchange so dangerous. This wasn't merely another clash of words. It was a collision of eras, the brash immediacy of social media politics slamming headfirst into the slow, deliberate weight of judicial legacy. One figure thrived on heat and disruption. the other on patience and permanence. And America, divided as it was, watched with bated breath to see which force would prevail. The symbolic stakes were enormous. If Crockett's fire consumed Ruth's calm, it would signal to a new generation that rage was not only acceptable, but triumphant. But if Ruth's silence and eventual response steadied the room, it would reaffirm that dignity still had power in an age of noise. This was more than a debate. It was a referendum on how the nation wanted to be represented. Every whisper in the gallery, every hand hovering over a phone's record button, reflected that tension. People knew they were witnessing something that would ripple outward, reshaping reputations and possibly altering careers. Crockett's allies prepared to celebrate what they assumed would be a crushing blow. Her opponents braced themselves, fearing they were about to see a legacy undone in real time. Because here was the truth. Moments like this don't just fade. They linger, replayed endlessly on feeds, analyzed in news cycles, remembered by history as either triumph or humiliation. One person would emerge strengthened, the other scarred. And as Crockett sharpened her words, the question became, could anyone withstand that kind of fire? Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to the spotlight. From the very beginning of her political ascent, she had embraced it with an audacity that made her impossible to ignore. In a political landscape often dominated by careful scripts and cautious speeches, she arrived like a lightning bolt, bright, unpredictable, electrifying. Her supporters hailed her as a breath of fresh air, someone unafraid to call out hypocrisy with the raw fire that so many others held back. She was brash, yes, but to them, brashness was honesty. To them, her refusal to soften her tone was a rebellion against decades of voices that had been silenced. Crockett built her reputation on the art of confrontation. Whether in committee hearings or in front of a roaring rally, she carried herself with the cadence of a preacher and the edge of a street fighter. Every sentence she delivered seemed forged to draw a line in the sand. You were either with her or against her, and she relished knowing exactly where people stood. Her charisma was undeniable. Crowds leaned in when she spoke. Young voters, hungry for authenticity, saw in her a reflection of their own anger and impatience. But beneath the applause and viral moments lived contradictions that even her closest allies couldn't ignore. The same energy that electrified her base often veered into arrogance. She would smirk when opponents struggled to respond, treating their hesitation not as an opening for dialogue, but as proof of her superiority. She cut people off mid-sentence, dismissing them with a wave of her hand or a sharp laugh. For those who admired her, this was boldness. For those who did not, it was arrogance clothed in conviction. Crockett's political style was born from fire, and fire is both a weapon and a danger to the one wielding it. Her greatest strengths, confidence, bluntness, speed, were also her weaknesses. She rarely paused long enough to consider whether her words built bridges or burned them. In an era where outrage often equaled attention, she leaned into provocation, calculating that controversy was a currency too valuable to ignore. And for a while, it paid off. Headlines carried her sound bites. Social feeds exploded with her clapbacks. She became a fixture in the conversation, feared by her rivals and adored by her base. Yet for every admirer who cheered her unfiltered defiance, there were others who began to whisper questions. Was she too reckless? Too quick to turn disagreement into hostility? Too enamored with the applause of the moment to think of the consequences that followed? Those whispers didn't quiet her. They only fueled her defiance. She doubled down, reminding her critics that history didn't reward the timid. And so Crockett positioned herself as the disruptor. In her view, institutions existed to be challenged, traditions to be shattered. Respect, in her vocabulary, was often just another word for submission. She cast herself as the righteous agitator in a system built on injustice, daring anyone to try and silence her. But disruption has its limits. For all the power her words carried, they were also laced with disdain. She didn't just critique, she mocked. She didn't simply challenge, she ridiculed. The very traits that made her magnetic on a stage also revealed an overconfidence that was beginning to show cracks. Crockett had become so accustomed to rattling others, so sure that her fire could consume any opponent, that she began to believe she was untouchable. This was the contradiction at the heart of her persona. She was both champion and risk, hero to some and cautionary tale to others. Her supporters saw her fearlessness as liberation. Her detractors saw it as arrogance barreling toward inevitable humiliation. In truth, both were right. Crockett was a force one who could electrify a room with her conviction, but who could just as easily ignite her own downfall with a single overreached sentence. That day in the chamber, she carried all of it with her. The charisma, the strength, the arrogance, the disdain. She believed her sharp tongue and unyielding presence would leave her opponent cornered, reduced to silence, unable to match her fire. For Crockett, the clash wasn't about dialogue. It was about dominance, and dominance, she thought, was already hers. But the woman sitting across from her had faced storms far fiercer than this. Long before the chamber fell silent under Crockett's fire, Judge Ruth Bader had lived her life inside storms that would have shattered lesser spirits. She was not a woman who stumbled into dignity by accident. She had carved it, brick by brick, through years of service, patience, and battles both public and private. To those who truly knew her, every wrinkle in her face was less a mark of age than a map of struggles endured and overcome. Ruth had grown up in a world that doubted her before she ever opened her mouth. From the very start, she was told she was too soft-spoken, too bookish, too unwilling to play the game of brash ambition that others around her mastered with ease. Yet it was precisely that quiet steadiness that became her weapon. Where others blustered, she studied. Where others shouted, she listened. And when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of thought sharpened by silence. Her life was built not on grandstanding, but on the hard, unglamorous work of principle. She had spent decades in courtrooms, community halls, and committee chambers, often standing alone with little more than a binder of facts and a spine of steel. Each case, each decision, had taught her the same truth. Real change was not delivered in explosions of anger, but in steady, deliberate persistence. She had endured ridicule. She had faced dismissal from those who believed dignity was weakness. But Ruth had learned early that patience was not the absence of power, it was its most disciplined form. She became the person who could sit through hours of insult and still deliver a single sentence that cut sharper than any outburst. And because of that, she grew into more than a judge. She became a symbol of what it meant to hold one's ground without losing one's humanity. Those who admired her often recalled the moments when she was pressed hardest, times when political tides turned against her, times when cameras crowded in, hungry for a stumble, a misstep, a flash of temper. But none came. Instead, Ruth would offer clarity where others expected collapse. Her composure wasn't naivety, it was armor. She carried herself with the weight of someone who understood that the dignity she maintained wasn't just her own, it belonged to every person who saw themselves, reflected in her resilience. Behind that steel exterior was a story of sacrifices most never knew, the nights spent away from family, the endless reading of case files while others slept, the lonely hours when the easy road would have been to say nothing at all, to let the storm pass. But Ruth chose the harder path again and again, because for her, silence in the face of injustice was a form of complicity. And if that meant enduring insult or condescension, so be it. She would not let history record her as passive. It was this lifelong discipline, this relentless devotion to principle, that made her stand apart in that chamber. Crockett's fire might have rattled anyone else, but for Ruth it was nothing new. She had heard worse. She had lived worse. Her composure wasn't staged for cameras, it was muscle memory, built from years of surviving battles no microphone had ever captured. And yet Ruth was not without warmth. Those close to her remembered her kindness, her small smiles, her belief in lifting others even while she carried her own burdens. She was respected not just for her intellect, but for her humanity. That humanity, that sense of fairness and empathy, was the reason why so many trusted her to stand firm when the moment demanded it. She represented not just law, but something larger, an unyielding faith in dignity as a moral compass. On the day of the confrontation, Ruth didn't come armed with fiery sound bites. She came with the weight of a lifetime that had already tested her beyond what Crockett could imagine. That was her advantage. She had nothing to prove. She didn't need to win applause or chase headlines. Her victory was in the steadiness itself, in proving that principle still had power even when chaos tried to drown it out. Every glance she cast that day carried the memory of decades where truth had been tested. Every pause she held contained the echoes of past battles, where her silence had been mistaken for surrender, only for her words to return stronger than ever. The room may not have known it yet, but Ruth was not simply waiting to respond to Crockett. She was preparing to summon history itself into the chamber. And so, when Crockett's words cut through the chamber, Ruth's reply came not from anger, but from history. The chamber seemed to shrink with every word Jasmine Crockett hurled across the aisle. Her voice was sharp, urgent, almost musical in its rhythm, each phrase punctuated by a glance meant to slice. "You sit there draped in dignity," she snapped. "But dignity has done little for the people gasping under broken systems. What you call principle, I call paralysis." The words hung like smoke, thick and choking. Cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of her expression. Crockett's eyes blazed with conviction, her hand striking the desk for emphasis. "You tell us to wait, to be patient, to trust in processes written by the powerful for the powerful. Tell me who benefits from your silence. Who gains when your calm keeps us chained?" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some shook their heads in awe at her ferocity. Others whispered uneasily, sensing lines being crossed. Crockett thrived on this reaction. She fed off the tension, pressing harder, daring anyone to stop her. "You represent the old guard clinging to respectability while real lives crumble. And when history asks who stood up, it will not remember your polite restraint. It will remember who shouted loudest for the truth." Through it all, Ruth Bader remained utterly still. Her eyes didn't waver. Her shoulders didn't shift. Not once did she flinch. The silence around her wasn't passive. It was deliberate, almost defiant. Where Crockett filled the air with thunder, Ruth allowed space for lightning to build unseen. Viewers watching from home could feel the imbalance. One figure on screen blazed with unchecked energy. The other sat anchored in an ocean of calm. The contrast was stark, mesmerizing, impossible to look away from. Social media lit up with split-screen comparisons. Fire versus stone. Commentators typed furiously, "Can she endure this barrage without breaking?" Inside the chamber, murmurs swelled as Crockett leaned closer to her microphone. She slowed her words now, savoring each syllable. "Maybe you fear me," she said with a mocking tilt of her head. "Maybe you know that the time for your kind of quiet dignity is over. Because if this is the best you can offer, Judge, then perhaps it's time to step aside and let real voices lead." The words were meant to cut deep, to draw blood before the watching nation. For a moment, even Crockett seemed to revel in the stillness that followed, as though she believed she had cornered Ruth into silence, her victory all but secured. But silence is a strange weapon. It can signal defeat, or it can signal something far more dangerous: preparation. Those who had followed Ruth's career knew what came next. The longer she waited, the sharper her eventual words would land. And as the chamber hung in breathless anticipation, it was clear she was waiting for the precise moment to strike. Crockett's smirk faltered just slightly, as Ruth's gaze locked onto her with a steadiness that felt immovable. The energy in the room shifted. The murmurs died. Even the restless tapping of reporters' pens seemed to quiet, as if the entire space were holding itself still, bracing for what was about to unfold. For Ruth had not come here to match fire with fire. She had come to show that some flames burn out quickly when faced with stone that has endured centuries. Then, with the room hanging on her every breath, Ruth leaned forward. Ruth's fingers unfolded slowly, deliberately, as though even the smallest gesture carried meaning. She leaned into the microphone, not with a rush of words, but with a silence so heavy it demanded attention. The pause stretched, long enough for Crockett's smirk to twitch, long enough for the gallery to hold its breath. Then, in a voice calm enough to slice through the tension, Ruth began. "You say dignity has done little for the people," she said, her tone level, steady. But dignity is not a tool of the powerful, it is the shield of the powerless. Without it, we are reduced to noise. And noise, Representative, may fill a room, but it does not build a future. The chamber stilled. A few murmurs tried to rise, but they quickly died. Ruth's words weren't loud, yet they carried with a resonance the microphones could not enhance. She did not glance at the cameras. She spoke as though she were addressing history itself, and everyone in the room knew it. Crockett shifted, her eyes narrowing, but Ruth pressed on. You call patience paralysis, but I call it endurance. Endurance is what allowed generations before us to march when their voices were dismissed, to fight in courts when doors were slammed in their faces, to keep pushing until the law itself had no choice but to change. She paused. I ask you, Representative, do you think those victories were won by volume or by perseverance? The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't charged with Crockett's fire, but weighted with reflection. Ruth's gaze remained fixed, her eyes steady, her presence unshaken. Progress is not measured by who shouts the loudest, she continued, but by who refuses to be moved. I have sat across from men who told me women did not belong in courtrooms. I have sat across from leaders who told me equality was a dream, not a right. They shouted too. They laughed too. But where are they now? Their noise has faded. Our endurance remains. Gasps rose from the gallery, the kind that signaled realization more than shock. People leaned forward in their seats, phones tilted again, not to capture Crockett's fire this time, but to record Ruth's composure, her every word a brick in a wall no fury could topple. Crockett's jaw tightened, but her retort never came. Her rhythm had been broken. Her fire found no oxygen against Ruth's steady presence. And you speak of fear, Ruth said, her voice deepening with a quiet edge. Fear is not mine. I have walked through decades where every decision I made was questioned. I have ruled when the weight of injustice pressed so heavily it seemed immovable. I did not fear then, and I do not fear now. Fear belongs to those who cannot endure silence, who cannot withstand patience, who mistake stillness for weakness. The chamber was silent again, but this time it was reverent, as though the room itself was reluctant to disturb the air Ruth's words had filled. Crockett's expression flickered, a mix of defiance and discomfort. For the first time, she seemed aware that the energy had shifted against her. Ruth's eyes softened, not in concession, but in clarity. I do not doubt your passion, Representative. Passion has its place. But passion without principle is a storm without direction. It destroys more than it builds. And I have seen enough destruction in my life to know this. What our country needs is not more noise. It needs steadiness. It needs the dignity to rise, again and again, even when mocked, even when doubted, even when dismissed. That is how progress survives. A collective murmur swept through the crowd, not hostile but awed. Heads nodded. Even those who had leaned toward Crockett's fire a moment earlier found themselves swayed by the gravity of Ruth's words. The chamber felt less like a battlefield now, and more like a sanctuary, where truth had been spoken with such weight it could not be ignored. Ruth leaned back slightly, letting the silence return, and then, after a pause so precise it felt rehearsed by history itself, she added, You may command this room with your fire today, but fire consumes itself quickly. Dignity endures long after the flames are gone. It was a line that landed like a verdict. No need for flourish, no need for raised voice. The words themselves carried the finality of a gavel striking wood. The reaction was immediate. A murmur swelled into applause before the gavel at the desk tried to restore order. Even among those who had bristled at Ruth's past decisions, there was no denying the power of what had just been said. Reporters scribbled frantically. Social media feeds erupted. Mic drop. Legendary. The moment she froze the room. Crockett sat back, her lips pressed tightly together. For once, no words leapt to her tongue. The fire that had filled her so easily before now flickered against a wall of calm it could not breach. She had not been defeated by louder rhetoric, but by the quiet strength of someone who had mastered storms before she was ever born. Ruth did not smile, did not gloat. She folded her hands once more, her silence returning as if to remind everyone that her power had never been in volume, but in presence. The chamber seemed suspended in that moment, time stretching thin. It was not just a reply. It was a lesson, etched into the room, into the cameras, into the memories of everyone who would replay this exchange for years to come. And as the last words fell, the room froze, before the aftershocks began. The silence in the chamber lingered like smoke after a fire, but outside those walls, the storm was only beginning. Within minutes of Ruth's final words, the clips began to spread. A single sentence: "Fire consumes itself quickly. Dignity endures long after the flames are gone," was cut, captioned, and launched into the digital bloodstream. What happened next was nothing short of a cultural eruption. Twitter feeds lit up first. Hashtags trended in rapid succession. Mic drop Ruth, dignity endures, and the simple but searing "she froze the room." Commentators who normally disagreed on everything shared the same 3-second clip of Ruth leaning forward, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. Memes followed, juxtaposing Crockett's fiery gestures with Ruth's stone-like poise. One viral image showed Crockett mid-swing at the podium, flame emojis blazing across the screen, with Ruth's reply underneath in stark black and white. The caption read, "Noise versus history." On TikTok, edits appeared within the hour. Young creators layered Ruth's words over cinematic music, cutting to slow-motion shots of Crockett's expression faltering. Others stitched reactions, jaws dropping on camera, eyes wide as they mouthed along with Ruth's closing line. A particularly viral video featured a teenager whispering into the camera, This is what composure looks like." The video racked up millions of views overnight. Cable news didn't wait either. Networks ran with bold headlines. Ruth Bader's quiet earthquake. Crockett meets her match. Dignity vs. fire, who won? Analysts replayed the moment frame by frame, pointing out Crockett's tightening jaw, Ruth's deliberate pauses, the audible gasps from the gallery. Some commentators framed it as a generational clash, others as a philosophical one. The politics of spectacle colliding with the politics of endurance. Public figures chimed in, each tweet or statement amplifying the moment. A celebrated author wrote, "We live in a world of noise. Thank you, Judge Ruth, for reminding us that silence and clarity still matter." A popular musician posted, "If you didn't watch the Crockett-Ruth debate today, you missed history. She didn't raise her voice once, and still she won." Even celebrities far outside politics shared the clip, labeling it iconic, legendary, the comeback of the century. But admiration was not universal. Crockett's defenders pushed back fiercely, arguing that Ruth's calm was nothing but polished condescension, a tactic designed to dismiss righteous anger. They trended their own counter tag, "Shireen's silence is complicity." Videos circulated of Crockett's earlier remarks, framed as the true voice of the people, a passion that Ruth's reply had failed to extinguish. To them, Crockett wasn't defeated. She was dismissed by an establishment figure who had perfected the art of quiet control. That clash of interpretations only fed the fire. Debate shows lined up panelists to argue not just about who won the exchange, but about what the moment meant. Was dignity still relevant in a world driven by viral spectacle? Or was Ruth's performance a relic of an older generation, masking resistance to progress behind eloquence? The public, however, spoke in numbers. Polls taken just days after the debate showed Ruth's favorability soaring, especially among younger viewers who admired her calm in the face of provocation. Comment sections filled with comments like, "I want to be that unshakable when life comes at me," and "She proved composure is power." The phrase, "frozen the room," became shorthand in online discourse, used whenever someone held their ground against a furious attack. Meanwhile, Crockett faced the kind of double-edged fame that accompanies viral defeats. Her supporters praised her courage, but critics clipped her smirks and fiery barbs, contrasting them with Ruth's steadiness in endless split-screen montages. She became the embodiment of noise consumed by its own flame, and whether fair or not, the internet cemented the narrative faster than her allies could challenge it. But perhaps the most telling ripple was quieter than hashtags or headlines. Across dinner tables, classrooms, and office hallways, people replayed Ruth's words as though they weren't just a reply to Crockett, but a message to them. Teachers quoted her in lectures about civil discourse. Parents pointed to her as an example of how to respond to bullies without losing composure. Even in workplaces, her line was repeated in meetings, a shorthand reminder that patience and dignity could carry more weight than the loudest voice in the room. This wasn't just a political clash anymore. It had become a cultural parable, a moment frozen in time, reshaped into lesson and legend, reminding a divided nation that truth sometimes speaks not in fire, but in stillness. But beyond the noise, Ruth's words carried a deeper truth. In the end, the clash between Ruth Bader and Jasmine Crockett was never just about two voices in a chamber. It was about the meaning of leadership itself, about which path America would honor, when the heat of conflict gave way to the cool gaze of history. Crockett's words had burned bright, fierce, and undeniable. But Ruth's reply reminded the nation of something deeper. That fire may dazzle in the moment, yet only dignity endures when the embers fade. Ruth's response was not a rebuttal delivered for the sake of winning points. It was a mirror held up to America. In her calm defiance, she revealed the question that lay beneath every headline, every meme, every trending hashtag. What do we value most as a people, noise or principle? The answer, though contested, could be felt in the reverence that followed her words. Composure is not weakness. It is not silence in the face of injustice. It is strength refined by patience, justice sharpened by restraint. Ruth embodied this truth in the chamber that day, showing that leadership does not always roar, it sometimes whispers, and in that whisper, it commands. Her demeanor became a living reminder that power is not measured in decibels, but in endurance, for immigrants who had endured taunts, yet kept working, for families who had faced prejudice, yet still taught their children kindness, for communities who had been told they didn't belong but chose to rise anyway. Ruth's words were validation. She had lived what so many felt, that dignity is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to rise above it. And this is what transformed the debate into more than a political skirmish. It became a parable about America's identity. Are we defined by rage that consumes itself, or by resilience that outlasts every insult? Ruth's quiet presence answered without boasting. We are strongest when we refuse to be shaken. The moral rippled outward. Viewers found themselves reflecting on their own lives, their own conflicts. How many times had they faced someone's fire and wondered if they should strike back just as hard? Ruth's example offered another way, not a call to passivity, but a call to stand firm, to answer with clarity instead of chaos, to remind opponents and ourselves that principle speaks louder than provocation. The resonance of her reply was not limited to politics. It touched on something universal, something that crosses divides of race, class, and identity. It reminded Americans that dignity is a language anyone can understand, a shield anyone can wield. And in a time when division runs deep, it suggested that perhaps the truest form of power is not the ability to dominate others, but the ability to hold one's own without losing humanity. That was the gift Ruth gave in that moment. Not just a response to Crockett, but a lesson for the nation. The storms will come. The noise will rise, but dignity unyielding. Unwavering dignity will always outlast the chaos. And as the debate faded into history, one lesson remained impossible to ignore. Judge Ruth Bader argues with Jasmine Crockett's statement. Her remarkable reply freezes the room. The title itself now feels less like a headline and more like a promise fulfilled. We witnessed not just a debate, but a moment that defined the difference between noise and principle, between arrogance and endurance. Crockett's fire may have roared, but Ruth's calm carried the weight of history. And in that chamber, we saw dignity triumph before our very eyes. This was more than politics. It was a reminder of who we are and who we still aspire to be. In Ruth's steady words, every immigrant who ever walked into a room feeling unwelcome heard validation. Every voice dismissed for being too quiet, too restrained, too different, found strength. Her reply wasn't just a takedown, it was a beacon. A declaration that truth spoken with calm conviction can still silence chaos. Moments like this are why we gather here, why we watch, why we share. Because in a world drowning in noise, we crave reminders that principle still matters, that justice still has a voice, that dignity still endures. So if this moment moved you, if you felt that spark of pride, that recognition of resilience, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to a movement that believes in something bigger than outrage. Together, we can keep amplifying the stories that remind us of our best selves. Because when history looks back, it won't remember the loudest voices. It will remember the ones who stood firm, who answered fire with dignity, and who proved that calm conviction can still freeze a room. And that's the story we'll carry forward together.